God is still on the throne, and prayer changes things. I'm glad to greet you with that familiar word. Invite you to join us for message number 2 in a series of 4 by our guest speaker, Reverend Jerry Church. Here for the second message in the series, Reverend J.R. Church on the subject, Money Wars.
The price of gold is fluctuating, and the value of the dollar is uncertain. There is talk of a possible Great Depression, and there is speculation that the money problem is worldwide. One headline recently read, "Bank lending rate raised to record, worsening of recession feared." And another headline read, "World economy slowing, monetary fund says impact underestimated." Where will it all end, this mad manipulation of our money? According to the World Book Encyclopedia, Volume 21, page 22, some economists and historians think there is a close connection between war and economic depression. They argue that in a worldwide depression, every country tries to protect itself at the expense of other countries. Each nation wants to cut down unemployment at home and tries to make sure that little is bought from abroad, which could be made by its own workers at home. This can easily be done by raising tariffs. It is sometimes called a way of exporting unemployment to other countries. The chief concern of any government during a depression is to get people back to work. One way to do this is by building armaments. If anger can be stirred against another country, or if people can be made to feel that they are in danger of attack, funds for military preparation are readily voted. Besides, the armed forces themselves give employment to many. When a nation makes war, its government always states the reason for the war. This is necessary if the people are to be united in the war effort. But the reasons given for a war need not be the same as its causes. The causes of war may be selfish, may be base, or even wicked. But the reasons stated are usually lofty and noble. Is such the case today? Let us go back in history and look at the possible correlation between the problems of a sagging economy and war. In early America, say 100 years before the Revolutionary War, in the mid-1600s, the British government would not allow our colonies to mint coins. But Massachusetts built a mint anyway. And from 1652 to 1683, several kinds of silver coins were minted. Then came the paper money, even though most of the early colonists used a barter system for trade. The colonial governments printed paper money to pay the cost of military attacks against Canada. In the 1700s, colonial governments continued to issue notes to pay their debts. By 1750, the colonies had more paper money than they had gold or silver for which to exchange it. As a result, many people found that the notes were not worth the value printed on them. In 1751, the British Parliament took steps to curb the colonial script, supposedly to keep it from becoming worthless. It prohibited Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Rhode Island from printing any more paper money. In 1764, the British Parliament ordered the rest of the colonies to stop issuing paper money. At the same time, the British government began to levy taxes against the colonies. On December 16, 1773, British ships lay in Boston Harbor loaded with 340 chests of tea. When the tea arrived in Boston, a committee called the Committee of Correspondence protested its arrival and called on Governor Thomas Hutchinson to order the loaded ships back to England. Hutchinson refused. About 7,000 persons gathered at the Old South Church. They repeated the request to Hutchinson, who refused again. At a signal from Samuel Adams, 40 to 50 men dressed as Indians boarded the unguarded ships, broke open the tea chests, and dumped the tea into the harbor. It has been notoriously referred to as the Boston Tea Party. The incident lit the fuse to an explosive situation and helped to bring on the Revolutionary War. During the years of 1775 to 1781, the Continental Congress issued a great amount of notes called Continentals. The value of these notes was stated in terms of Spanish silver coins called dollars. However, the Continentals quickly lost value because they greatly outnumbered the supply of Spanish dollars. Americans began to describe anything worthless as not worth a Continental. In October 1781, George Washington's army of about 17,000 men surrounded Yorktown and began attacking British troops who were under the command of Major General Charles Cornwallis. The siege lasted for 3 weeks and ended in the surrender of Cornwallis and his 8,000 soldiers. This was the last major battle of the Revolutionary War. One of the first acts of the Continental Congress at the close of the war was to redeem all of the colonial scrip, the Continentals, at 100 cents on the dollar. Question: where did they get all that silver to redeem a currency that was not worth a Continental? At this point in history enters the story of an old professor in Durant, Oklahoma, just after the turn of the century. I believe the date was somewhere around 1908. The gentleman had been a professor at Harvard University, but had moved to Durant, Oklahoma, and had taken a position in the local high school. He closed a history book one day, sat down on the corner of his desk, and said to his class, "Now let me tell you what really happened." According to his story, George Washington and his colonial troops were getting weary of the war when word came from certain European bankers through their agent Alexander Hamilton that a peace could be negotiated, provided a central bank would be established, allowing the European bankers, primarily the Bank of England, to control our currency. A private agreement was made, bringing about the conclusion of the war. When Thomas Jefferson heard of the negotiations, he was furious. He said that to allow European bankers to establish a central bank, thus controlling our currency, was like putting a British soldier in every home. Now, I do not know if the story is true. We have only the word of a history professor long deceased. The story is not given in the history books. But if his story is not true, why was Cornwallis allowed to leave the shores of the United States with his 8,000 troops, along with their armaments, artillery, and ammunition? Another question: where did the silver come from with which to redeem the worthless Continental? It was redeemed at 100 cents on the dollar. The colonial scrip had been so worthless, people were papering their walls with it. Suddenly, several politicians became very wealthy men. At the conclusion of the Revolutionary War, Alexander Hamilton established his central bank in New York City. It is said that Thomas Jefferson was so furious he resigned Washington's cabinet. History does declare that Jefferson opposed Hamilton in the establishment of the bank, claiming it was unconstitutional. According to the World Book Encyclopedia, Volume 2, page 60, Alexander Hamilton's National Bank handled the payments of the public debt for the Treasury, received subscriptions for new issues of government securities, and even paid the salaries of public officials. Thomas Jefferson became president in 1801. He served until 1809. During those years, he continued to oppose the bank and evidently persuaded several congressmen to agree that the bank was unconstitutional. When the 20-year charter for the central bank came up for renewal in 1811, it was denied. Guess what happened in 1812? Yep, you guessed it, another war. It was called the War of 1812. And again, the British were defeated. Or were they? For you see, in 1816, a new 20-year charter was issued to the central bank. One of the heroes of the War of 1812 was Andrew Jackson. He was called Old Hickory because of his toughness, and he became president in 1829. He hated the central bank. He called them a bunch of snakes. In 1833, Jackson ordered the Secretary of the Treasury to remove government deposits from the Bank of the United States and place them in state banks. The withdrawal of the government's funds reduced the power of the national bank. In 1836, when the 20-year charter for the bank came up for renewal, Jackson managed to get it defeated. On January 8, 1835, Andrew Jackson paid off the final installment of the national debt. He was the only president ever to do so. The United States of America was at last out from under the control of the European banking houses. What happened next? The Civil War. With the refusal of the Congress in 1836 to renew the charter for the central bank, there coincidentally arose a dissension between the North and the South. The issue was slavery. But was it the cause? We cannot say with certainty that the Civil War was fomented by the European banking houses, but immediately the question comes, who backed the Confederate money used to fight the war? The answer? The European banking houses. Originally, the war was not to be a civil war. In 1836, the year the charter was denied to the National Bank, Mexico invaded Texas. I'm sure you've all heard of the fall of the Alamo on March 5, 1836. It is believed that the Mexican troops intended to push northward to the Mason-Dixon line and eastward to the Atlantic coast. Thus, the South would be ruled by Mexico. Other troops were stationed in Canada during those days in an effort to invade all of the territory north of the Mason-Dixon line. When those two attempted invasions failed, certain politicians began to stir up strife between the North and the South. The matter was somewhat complicated in 1849 when gold was discovered in San Francisco, California, and in 1859 when the Comstock lode was discovered in Colorado. Suddenly, the European banking houses were left out in the cold. Real money, gold and silver, provided a new potential prosperity for the United States. This obviously would keep the United States from the control of the international bankers. 2 years later, in 1861, the Civil War was begun. Abraham Lincoln refused to borrow money from the European bankers with which to fight the war. Instead, he printed the greenback, a $2 bill with which he financed the war. When the war was over, I'm told, he refused to honor the $2 bill at face value. He intended to pay only 50 cents on the dollar. Somehow, he ended up dead. And strangely enough, the $2 bill was honored at face value. In the years that followed, there was a continual struggle in America's economy. The economy sagged in the mid-1870s. There was a depression in 1884 and a panic in 1893. There was another panic in 1907. Each recession seemed to be an effort by the international bankers to cripple our economy in hopes of convincing Congress to allow a central bank. Thus ends the story of an old college professor from Harvard University to a group of high school students in Durant, Oklahoma, back in 1908. During the years after the Civil War, Congress refused to turn our nation's economy over to the European bankers. And though we suffered economic recession, that was the period of America's greatest growth. The industrial age flourished. Free enterprise had its heyday. In 1876, the telephone was invented, and from it came our modern means of communications. From those days came the automobile and the airplane. On March 4th, 1913, Woodrow Wilson was inaugurated as the 28th President of the United States. During his campaign, he had promised to clean up those, quote, wolves of Wall Street, end of quote. Immediately after his election, however, he set about to establish a central bank. He turned out to be one of those wolves in sheep's clothing. The bill was introduced on June 23rd of that year. It was hotly debated for some 6 months, but finally was passed in December of 1913 during the Christmas recess while most congressmen were out of town, thus establishing the Federal Reserve System. Guess what happened the next year? Yep, you guessed it. World War I. Shortly before noon, on June 28, 1914, crowds gathered in the capital of the Austrian province of Bosnia. They came to see the Archduke Francis Ferdinand and his wife Sophie. Suddenly, a man jumped on the running board of the royal touring car and fired a pistol. 2 shots struck Ferdinand and 1 hit Sophie, who was trying to shield him. They both died almost immediately. As a result, war was declared on July 28th. On July 30th, Russia ordered general mobilization. On August 1st, Germany declared war on Russia. On August 3rd, Germany declared war on France. On August 4th, Germany invaded Belgium, and on the story goes. There were many reasons for the war, but what was the cause? The economy of the United States and Europe had been upset. There had been a change, and change always brings on uncertainty. Then came the Depression that rocked America. The fateful day came on October 18, 1929. Our economy was devastated. Millionaires became paupers, while others lost their life savings. Many committed suicide. They just couldn't take sudden poverty. President Hoover was blamed for the Depression, and as a result, lost the election in 1932. A new president came to power at that time, Franklin D. Roosevelt. And on March 6, 1933, immediately after his inauguration, he called for a bank holiday. All banks were closed in an effort to help stop the money panic that was spreading in the nation. Depositors had been withdrawing their funds at such speed that many banks ran out of money with which to pay over the counter. The following year, in 1934, Congress passed the Gold Reserve Act. The government stopped minting gold coins, and persons could no longer hold gold money. President Roosevelt called in all the gold held by citizens throughout the United States and redeemed it for $20.67 an ounce. Immediately after the gold was, shall we say, confiscated, the value of it was set at $35 an ounce. It seems obvious that somebody became rich overnight. Guess what happened next? Yep, you guessed it, another war. World War II was another money war. On September 1st, 1939, Germany attacked Poland, thus beginning the most devastating war in the history of the human race. World War II killed more people, cost more money, damaged more property, affected more lives, and probably caused more far-reaching changes than any other war of history. Many were the reasons, but what was the cause? Obviously, the world's economy was affected when the United States went off the gold standard. I'm reminded of a prophecy in James chapter 5, verses 1 through 3. Go to now, ye rich men, weep and howl for your miseries that shall come upon you. Your riches are corrupted, and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver is cankered, and the rest of them shall be a witness against you, and shall eat your flesh as it were fire. Ye have heaped treasure together for the last days. Verse 4 continues, Behold, the hire of the laborers who have reaped down your fields, which is of you kept back by fraud, crieth, and the cries of them that have reaped are entered into the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth. Ye have lived in pleasure on the earth, and been wanton. Ye have nourished your hearts as in a day of slaughter. Ye have condemned and killed the just, and he doth not resist you. Going off the gold standard may well have begun the fulfillment of that prophecy. Today, we face a collapsing economy and a dying dollar. The European common market nations are establishing a new European currency. What will it do to the dollar? How traumatic will be the effects? Only a few years ago, Congress passed another bill allowing Americans to own gold. At that time, the government began auctioning America's gold. Since then, the price of gold has gone from $35 an ounce to new record highs. Presently, gold is fluctuating, but who knows? Within a few short months or years, the price of gold may go to $2,000 an ounce. If it does, will the value of gold have gone up? No. It simply means the value of the dollar has declined. Now, whether by accident or by manipulation, nevertheless, a new one-world economy will soon be introduced. How do I know? Because the Bible prophesies that a 10-nation European confederation will arise upon the world scene and seek to establish a loosely knit world government, through which they will introduce a new one-world currency. Once this currency is established, no person on earth will be allowed to buy or sell unless he has the proper identification, called in the Bible the mark of the beast. Question: in the light of today's headlines, will the world soon wage another war? The headlines read, World Economy Slowing. Monetary Fund says impact underestimated. And another headline, Bank lending rate raised to record. Worsening of recession feared. Yes, there will be another war. Are you afraid? Listen then to Matthew chapter 24, verse 6. And ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that ye be not troubled, for all these things must come to pass. Look beyond the cloudy skies, dear Christian. Christ is soon to come.
Thank you, Brother Church, for that stirring and unusual message on the subject money wars. Don't miss the message tomorrow on the subject rich man's war, poor man's fight. Very relevant to the day in which we live and revealing as to the generation in which we live. Until the next broadcast, God bless you, each and every one.